The day Lauren Matthews was supposed to marry the love of her life became the day everything she believed about her family shattered into a million pieces. Standing at the altar in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, she had no idea that a simple paternity test ordered by her biological mother would destroy the man who raised her and reveal secrets that had been buried for 23 years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Lauren had always known she was different from her half-siblings. While her younger brother Jake had their father's piercing blue eyes and her sister Emma shared his stubborn chin, Lauren possessed features that seemed to come from nowhere. Her dark auburn hair caught light differently than anyone else's in the family, and her hazel eyes held flecks of gold that neither parent could claim. But Richard Matthews never treated her as anything less than his flesh and blood. From the moment he married Lauren's mother Diana, when Lauren was just 4 years old, he became the only father she'd ever known. Her biological father had walked out before she could even speak his name, leaving behind only a void that Richard filled completely. Growing up in their suburban Denver home, Lauren's childhood was painted with memories of Richard teaching her to ride her first bike in the driveway, his steady hands guiding her wobbly attempts. He was the one who showed up to every soccer game, cheering louder than any other parent when she scored her first goal. When she struggled with algebra in 8th grade, Richard spent countless evenings at the kitchen table, patiently working through equations until the concepts finally clicked. The basement of their house became their sanctuary. Richard had converted half of it into a woodworking shop, and Lauren would spend hours there with him, learning to sand, measure, and cut. The smell of sawdust and the sound of his gentle instructions created some of her most treasured memories. Together, they built a bookshelf for her room when she turned 12, a coffee table when she graduated high school, and most recently, a beautiful jewelry box that he'd planned to give her as a wedding gift. Diana had always seemed slightly distant, but Lauren attributed this to her mother's naturally reserved personality. She worked long hours as a nurse at Presbyterian Medical Center, often coming home exhausted and preoccupied. Richard, who managed a small construction company, had more flexible hours and naturally became the parent Lauren turned to for everything from homework help to relationship advice. When Lauren brought home her college boyfriend Marcus Chen during her junior year at Colorado State University, Richard was the one who grilled him good-naturedly about his intentions. When that relationship ended, Richard was there with ice cream and terrible dad jokes to cheer her up. And when she met David Rodriguez at a friend's wedding 2 years later, Richard was the first to notice how differently Lauren smiled when she talked about this new man in her life. David was everything Lauren had hoped to find in a partner. An environmental lawyer with a quick wit and kind heart, he shared her love of hiking and cooking elaborate Sunday dinners. He fit seamlessly into the Matthews family dynamic, helping Richard with weekend projects and charming Diana with his knowledge of vintage movies. Even Jake and Emma, now teenagers with typical sibling skepticism about their sisters' boyfriends, genuinely liked David. The proposal came on a crisp October morning during their annual camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park. David had arranged for Richard to hike ahead and capture the moment on camera from a distance, understanding how important it was for Lauren to share this milestone with the man she considered her father. When she said yes through tears of joy, Richard was the first person she hugged after David, his own eyes misty with pride. Wedding planning became a family affair that brought out the best in everyone. Richard threw himself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of a man planning his daughter's dream day. He researched venues, compared catering options, and even learned to fold origami cranes for the centerpieces because Lauren had mentioned loving them. Diana participated more actively than she had in family activities for years, helping Lauren choose flowers and accompanying her to dress fittings. The venue they selected was the Chatfield Botanic Gardens, a place that held special meaning because Richard had taken Lauren there every spring since she was 5 to see the wildflower blooms. The wedding date was set for the third Saturday in June, ensuring the gardens would be at their most spectacular. As the months passed, Richard's excitement became infectious. He talked constantly about walking Lauren down the aisle, about the speech he was preparing for the reception, about how proud he was of the woman she'd become. He spent evenings in the basement working on surprise wedding gifts for the young couple, a handcrafted dining table and matching chairs that would become their first real furniture as husband and wife. Lauren had never seen her stepfather happier than during those months of preparation. He would wake up humming wedding songs, spend his lunch breaks calling vendors to confirm details, and fall asleep reading wedding planning books he'd borrowed from the library. His joy was so pure and overwhelming that it made Diana's continued emotional distance even more noticeable, though Lauren tried not to dwell on it. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything changed with a single phone call that came on a Tuesday evening while the family was finishing dinner. Diana answered with her usual tired hello, but her voice quickly shifted to something she had never heard before, a sharp, defensive tone that made everyone at the table look up from their plates. The conversation was brief and cryptic, filled with Diana's clipped responses. "That's impossible. After all these years, this is not the time." When she hung up, her face had gone completely pale and excused herself immediately, claiming she needed to lie down because of a headache. Richard tried to follow her upstairs, but Diana closed her bedroom door firmly behind her. Through the thin walls, Lauren could hear the muffled sounds of a heated discussion that continued long into the night. Jake and Emma exchanged worried glances across the dinner table, but Lauren found herself frozen, unable to process what she was witnessing. The next morning, Diana announced she needed to take some personal time off work. She spent the following days making mysterious phone calls from behind closed doors and taking long drives alone, returning home with red-rimmed eyes and an increasingly fragile demeanor. Richard's attempts to discuss whatever was troubling her were met with sharp rebuttals or complete silence. Lauren tried to focus on the final wedding preparations, but the tension in the house was suffocating. The man who had been overflowing with excitement just days before now moved through their home like a ghost, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by confused worry. The basement workshop, once filled with the sounds of his projects and Lauren's laughter, remained silent and unused. The morning of Lauren's final dress fitting, Diana didn't come downstairs for breakfast. Richard sat at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold, staring at his phone with the expression of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight. When Lauren asked if everything was okay, he managed a weak smile and mumbled something about work stress. Lauren drove to the bridal boutique alone, something that felt wrong given how involved her family had been throughout the planning process. The dress fit perfectly, a vintage-inspired gown with delicate beadwork that caught the light like scattered diamonds. But standing in front of the three-way mirror, she felt an unexpected emptiness where excitement should have been. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly seamstress who had been handling the alterations, noticed Lauren's subdued mood immediately. "Wedding nerves, dear?" she asked gently while pinning the hem. "Every bride gets them." But Lauren knew this wasn't about typical pre-wedding anxiety. Something fundamental had shifted in her household, and the silence from her parents was becoming deafening. She tried calling David from the car afterward, needing his steady presence to ground her, but he was in court and couldn't talk. When she arrived home, she found Jake shooting basketballs alone in the driveway with more aggression than usual. At 16, he typically brushed off family drama with teenage indifference, but today his jaw was tight with frustration. "Mom's been crying in her room again," he said without looking at Lauren. "Dad's been pacing the house like a caged animal. What the hell is going on?" Lauren wished she had answers for her brother, but she was just as confused. Emma, now 14 and typically dramatic about everything, had been uncharacteristically quiet for days. She spent most of her time at friends' houses, avoiding the tension that had settled over their home like a heavy fog. That evening, Lauren decided to confront the situation directly. She found Richard in the basement, not working on any project, but simply sitting on his workbench, holding a piece of sandpaper he wasn't using. The sight of him looking so defeated broke something inside her chest. "Dad," she said softly, using the title that had always come naturally despite their lack of blood relation. "Please talk to me. What's happening?" Richard looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in just a few days. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, then closed it again. Finally, he reached for her hand with his calloused fingers. "Lauren, sweetheart, I need you to know that no matter what happens, you are my daughter. You've been my daughter since the day I married your mother, and that will never change." The formal tone of his words, so different from his usual casual warmth, sent chills down her spine. "What do you mean, no matter what happens? You're scaring me." Before Richard could respond, Diana appeared at the top of the basement stairs. Her voice was sharp when she called down, "Richard, we need to talk, now." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next few days passed in a blur of whispered conversations that stopped when Lauren entered rooms, phone calls that were taken in private, and a growing sense that her wedding was happening in the shadow of some enormous secret. David noticed the change immediately when he came over for their weekly dinner with her family. "Your parents seemed stressed," he mentioned quietly while helping her clear dishes. "Is everything okay with the wedding expenses? We can scale back if money's tight." Lauren appreciated his concern, but she knew this wasn't about finances. Richard had been saving for her wedding since she graduated college, treating it as his most important investment. The man who would normally be showing David his latest woodworking project or discussing plans for the ceremony barely spoke during dinner. 2 days before the wedding, while Lauren was at the florist confirming final arrangements, Diana made a decision that would change everything. She drove to a medical laboratory across town and requested a paternity test kit. The technician explained the process with clinical detachment. Simple cheek swabs, results in 48 to 72 hours. Diana sat in her car in the parking lot for 20 minutes after picking up the kit, her hands shaking as she stared at the sealed envelope. She had carried this secret for 24 years, convincing herself that some truths were better left buried. But the phone call from Lauren's biological father had shattered that illusion. Thomas Brennan had tracked Diana down through social media, claiming he wanted to meet his daughter before it was too late. He'd seen Lauren's engagement announcement in the local newspaper and recognized her face immediately. She had his mother's distinctive features, the same eyes, the same smile. He'd been clean and sober for 5 years, had built a successful plumbing business in Phoenix, and wanted to make amends for walking away all those years ago. Diana had told him it was impossible, that Lauren had a father who had raised her with love and devotion, but Thomas had been persistent, threatening to show up at the wedding if she didn't arrange a meeting. In desperation, she'd claimed that Lauren wasn't his daughter, that she'd been uncertain about paternity all those years ago, and that Richard was likely the biological father. It was a lie born of panic, but Thomas had called her bluff. He offered to pay for a paternity test to settle the matter once and for all. If Lauren wasn't his daughter, he would disappear forever. If she was, he wanted the chance to explain himself and possibly be part of her life. Diana knew the truth, had always known it. The timing of Lauren's birth left no doubt about her paternity. Richard had been deployed overseas with his National Guard unit when Lauren was conceived. But admitting this would mean confessing to an affair she'd managed to bury so deeply that even she sometimes forgot it had happened. The evening before the wedding, Diana finally gathered the courage to approach Richard with the paternity test kit. She found him in their bedroom, polishing his dress shoes for the ceremony. His face lit up when he saw her, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "I can't believe our little girl is getting married tomorrow," he said, setting down the shoe polish. "I've been practicing my speech all week. I think I've got it memorized, but I'll probably cry through the whole thing anyway." Diana's resolve crumbled seeing his joy, but she knew she couldn't let him walk Lauren down the aisle without knowing the truth. She placed the test kit on the bed between them and watched as confusion, then understanding, then devastation cross his features. "Diana," he whispered, his voice breaking on her name, "what are you telling me?" The conversation that followed lasted until dawn, filled with 24 years of buried truths, accusations, denials, and finally, terrible honesty. Richard learned about Thomas Brennan, about the affair that had happened during a period when their marriage was struggling, about the secret Diana had carried while watching him pour his heart into raising a daughter who might not be biologically his. By sunrise, they had both provided samples for the test. The lab promised expedited results within 24 hours. Diana had called in favors and paid extra fees to ensure they would know the truth before Lauren walked down the aisle. Richard spent the morning of the wedding in a daze, going through the motions of getting ready while his world crumbled around him. He helped Lauren's cousin set up chairs at the venue, picked up the flowers, and smiled at everyone who congratulated him on his daughter's big day. But inside, he felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Lauren noticed something was wrong the moment she saw him at the venue. Despite his best efforts to appear normal, she could see the strain in his shoulders, the forced nature of his smiles. When she asked if he was feeling all right, he hugged her tighter than usual and told her he loved her. "I love you too, Dad," she replied, and the words hit him like physical blows. The morning of Lauren's wedding dawned with perfect Colorado sunshine streaming through the windows of the bridal suite at the Chatfield Botanic Gardens. Lauren's college roommate, Sarah, was carefully applying the final touches of makeup, while her maid of honor, her cousin Jessica, steamed any remaining wrinkles from the wedding dress. The room buzzed with excitement and nervous energy as bridesmaids fluttered around, adjusting flowers and taking photos. Lauren sat in front of the vanity mirror, trying to focus on Sarah's chatter about the ceremony timeline, but her mind kept drifting to her parents' strange behavior over the past few weeks. She'd barely seen her mother that morning. Diana had dropped off Lauren's grandmother's pearl necklace and disappeared again, claiming she needed to check on last-minute details with the caterer. "Earth to Lauren," Jessica laughed, waving a hand in front of her cousin's face. "I asked if you wanted the veil higher or lower." "Sorry," Lauren smiled apologetically. "Higher, I think, like we practiced." As Jessica adjusted the delicate veil, Lauren caught sight of her reflection and felt a surge of emotion. She looked exactly like the bride she'd dreamed of being since childhood, radiant, elegant, and ready to start her life with David. If only she could shake the feeling that something important was missing from this perfect picture. Meanwhile, in the groom's preparation room across the garden, David was having his own moment of pre-ceremonial jitters. His groomsmen were joking around, trying on boutonnieres and taking selfies, but David found himself staring out the window toward the ceremony space where guests were beginning to arrive. His best man, his brother Miguel, noticed David's contemplative mood. "Second thoughts?" he asked, only half joking. "No," David replied immediately. "Not about Lauren. Never about Lauren. It's just, her family's been acting strange lately. I'm worried something's wrong that she's not telling me about." Miguel clapped him on the shoulder. "Wedding stress affects everyone differently, man. Once you two are married, whatever family drama exists will sort itself out." David nodded, hoping his brother was right, but he couldn't shake his concern for Lauren. He'd noticed the dark circles under her eyes during their rehearsal dinner, the way she'd seemed distracted even during their most intimate moments together. In the parking lot, Richard sat in his car with his phone in his hands, waiting for the call that would change everything. Diana had texted him an hour earlier. "Lab results due any minute. We'll call as soon as I know." The wedding was scheduled to begin in 90 minutes, and guests were already arriving. He watched through his windshield as Lauren's college friends walked toward the venue in their summer dresses, laughing and carrying gift bags. David's extended family from New Mexico was gathering near the entrance, speaking rapid Spanish and embracing each other warmly. Everything looked exactly as it should for a perfect wedding day. Richard's phone rang, and Diana's name appeared on the screen. His heart hammered against his ribs as he answered. "The results are in." Diana's voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas Brennan is Lauren's biological father. The probability is 99.97%. The world seemed to stop moving around Richard. He could see guests continuing to arrive, could hear the distant sound of the string quartet beginning their pre-ceremony music, and could smell the roses from the nearby garden beds. But none of it felt real anymore. "Richard, are you there?" "I'm here," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "What are we going to do?" Diana asked, and he could hear that she'd been crying. "The wedding starts in an hour and 20 minutes. Richard closed his eyes and leaned his head against the steering wheel. 23 years of fatherhood, every bedtime story, every scraped knee he'd bandaged, every proud moment at school plays and soccer games, every piece of advice he'd given, every tear he'd dried, all of it built on a foundation that had just crumbled beneath his feet. "We don't tell her today," he said finally, his voice stronger than he felt. "This is her wedding day. She deserves to have this day be perfect." "But Richard—" "No," he interrupted, and there was steel in his tone now. "Lauren is walking down that aisle in 75 minutes, and I'm going to be the one to walk her there. Whatever we need to figure out, we'll deal with it after the honeymoon. Today, she will be happy." Diana was quiet for a long moment. What about Thomas? He's expecting an answer. "Tell him the truth. Tell him he's her father. But also tell him that if he shows up here today, if he ruins her wedding, I will make sure he regrets it for the rest of his life. He's waited 23 years. He can wait 2 more weeks." Richard hung up the phone and sat in the silence of his car for another 10 minutes, allowing himself to grieve for the relationship he thought he had with Lauren. Then he straightened his tie, checked his appearance in the rearview mirror, and walked toward the venue to play the most important role of his life, Lauren's father on her wedding day. Inside the bridal suite, Lauren was experiencing her own emotional moment. As Jessica fastened the pearl necklace around her neck, Lauren thought about her grandmother, who had worn these same pearls on her own wedding day 60 years earlier. The weight of family history and tradition felt both comforting and overwhelming. "I wish Grandma Rose could have been here," Lauren said softly, touching the pearls. "She is here," Jessica replied, squeezing her cousin's shoulders. "Every time you touch those pearls today, she's right there with you." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. "15 minutes, ladies," called the wedding coordinator. "Time for final touches and photos with Dad." Lauren's heart skipped with excitement. The father-daughter photos had been something she'd been looking forward to all morning. Richard had been such an integral part of every major moment in her life, and having professional pictures of them together on her wedding day felt like the perfect way to honor their relationship. When Richard entered the bridal suite, the room fell silent. Even with everything he was carrying inside, he couldn't help but be struck by how beautiful Lauren looked. She was radiant in her grandmother's dress, her face glowing with happiness, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Oh, Dad," she breathed, standing up carefully to avoid stepping on her train. "Do I look okay?" Richard's throat constricted as he looked at his daughter, because regardless of DNA, that's exactly what she was. "Lauren, you are the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," he said, and meant every word. The photographer captured their embrace, the way Richard's hands trembled slightly as he held her, the pure joy on Lauren as she looked up at the man who had raised her with unwavering love. Neither of them knew these would be the last photographs taken before their relationship changed forever. As the bridesmaids filed out to take their positions for the processional, Lauren and Richard were left alone for their traditional moment before the ceremony. This was when he had planned to give his pre-wedding speech, the words he'd been practicing for months about how proud he was of the woman she'd become and how excited he was to welcome David into their family. Instead, he found himself memorizing every detail of her face, storing up this moment of pure happiness before the world became complicated. "Are you ready to walk me down the aisle, Dad?" Lauren asked, adjusting his boutonniere with gentle fingers. "I've been ready for this moment since you were 4 years old," Richard replied, and that, at least, was completely true. Outside, the string quartet began playing the processional music, and guests rose to their feet in anticipation of the bride's entrance. The processional began with Emma walking down the aisle first, her teenage awkwardness transformed into graceful elegance as she took measured steps to the string quartet's melody. Jake followed as one of David's groomsmen, looking handsome and mature in his charcoal gray suit. Lauren watched from the bridal suite doorway as her siblings took their places, feeling overwhelmed by love for her family. Diana appeared at Lauren's side, her face carefully composed despite the turmoil of the morning. She had reapplied her makeup twice to hide the evidence of her tears, and now she squeezed her cousin's hand with trembling fingers. "You look perfect, sweetheart," whispered, her voice thick with emotion that Lauren interpreted as typical mother-of-the-bride sentiment. As the bridesmaids began their walk down the rose-petal-scattered aisle, Richard offered his arm to Lauren with practiced steadiness. The weight of the paternity results sat like lead in his chest, but he had made his decision. Today was about Lauren's happiness, about celebrating the love she'd found with David, about giving her the perfect wedding day she deserved. "Ready, Princess?" he asked, using the nickname he'd called her since childhood. Lauren beamed up at him, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears of joy. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The moment they stepped into view of the assembled guests, a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Lauren was luminous in the afternoon sunlight, her grandmother's dress catching the light like captured moonbeams. But it was the expression on Richard's face that moved many guests to tears. The look of absolute pride and love, tinged with something deeper that most people couldn't identify. David, waiting at the altar with the officiant and his groomsmen, felt his breath catch when he saw his bride. She was more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, radiant with happiness and confidence. But his eyes also tracked to Richard, noting something different in the older man's demeanor, an intensity that seemed almost protective, as if he were guarding something precious. As they walked slowly down the aisle, Richard found himself cataloging every second. The way Lauren's hand felt on his arm, light but trusting. The soft rustle of her dress against the flower petals. The way she nodded and smiled at guests while maintaining perfect posture, just as they'd practiced during rehearsal. The scent of her perfume, the same vanilla and jasmine fragrance she'd worn since high school. Halfway down the aisle, Lauren leaned closer to him. "Thank you for everything, Dad, for being the most amazing father a girl could ask for." The words nearly broke Richard's composure entirely. He squeezed her hand gently and managed to respond, "Thank you for letting me be your dad, Lauren. It's been the greatest privilege of my life." When they reached the altar, the officiant asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Richard's voice was clear and strong when he replied, "Her mother and I do, with joy and blessing." He kissed Lauren's cheek, whispered "I love you" in her ear, and placed her hand in David's before taking his seat in the front row. The ceremony proceeded beautifully. Lauren and David had written their own vows, and their words to each other were deeply personal and moving. David spoke about how Lauren had taught him that home wasn't a place, but a person, and that with her, he'd found both his best friend and his greatest adventure. Lauren's vows focused on David's steadiness and kindness, how he'd shown her that love could be both passionate and peaceful. As they exchanged rings, Richard watched with a complex mixture of emotions. His heart swelled with happiness for Lauren, seeing how perfectly matched she and David were, how their love illuminated both of their faces. But underneath that joy was a growing dread about the conversation that would inevitably come after the honeymoon. The reception was held in the garden's pavilion, strung with fairy lights and decorated with wildflowers that complemented the natural beauty of the setting. Lauren and David's first dance was to "At Last" by Etta James, and they moved together with the easy grace of a couple completely in sync with each other. When it came time for the father-daughter dance, Richard had specifically requested "Butterfly Kisses" by Bob Carlyle, a song that had always held special meaning for them. As they swayed together on the dance floor, Lauren rested her head against his shoulder, just like she had as a little girl. "I know I'm not your biological daughter," she said quietly, speaking words that cut through Richard like a blade. "But you've been more of a father to me than my real dad ever could have been." Richard's steps faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Lauren, where did that come from?" She lifted her head to look at him, her eyes serious. "I've always known, Dad. Maybe not consciously when I was little, but I figured it out as I got older. We don't look anything alike, and you were deployed when Mom would have gotten pregnant with me. But it never mattered to me, because you chose to be my father in every way that counts." The revelation that Lauren had known about her paternity all along hit Richard like a physical blow. All these years, he'd thought he was protecting her from a difficult truth, while she'd been protecting him from her knowledge of it. "Does your mother know that you know?" he asked carefully. Lauren shook her head. "I never saw any reason to bring it up. You're my dad in every way that matters. The man who donated DNA might be my biological father, but you're the one who raised me, who loved me, who taught me everything I know about what a good man looks like." As the song continued, Richard felt a different kind of emotional weight settling over him. Learning that Lauren had always known shifted everything about the morning's revelation. She had consciously chosen him as her father, just as he had chosen her as his daughter. "Lauren," he said carefully, "what if your biological father wanted to meet you? What would you think about that?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the hypothetical question. "I guess it would depend on why he wanted to meet me now, after all these years. If he was looking for some kind of relationship or trying to make up for lost time, I'd probably be interested in hearing what he had to say. But you would always be my dad. Nothing could change that. The dance ended with Richard feeling both relief and continued anxiety. Lauren's attitude toward potentially meeting her biological father was more open than he'd expected, but the circumstances of Thomas Brennan's sudden reappearance were still problematic. During the reception dinner, Richard delivered his father of the bride speech, the one he'd been perfecting for months. He spoke about watching Lauren grow from a shy 4-year-old into a confident, compassionate woman. He talked about her determination, her kindness, and her ability to find joy in simple moments. He welcomed David into their family and expressed his confidence that Lauren had chosen a partner worthy of her love. The speech received a standing ovation, and Lauren cried through most of it, not caring that her mascara was running. When Richard sat back down, Diana reached over and squeezed his hand, the first genuine moment of connection they'd shared since the paternity results had arrived. As the evening wound down, guests began to leave. Lauren and David prepared for their departure to their honeymoon suite at a nearby resort. They would fly to Italy the next morning for 2 weeks in Tuscany, a trip that Richard and Diana had given them as a wedding gift. During the final round of hugs and goodbyes, Lauren clung to Richard a little longer than usual. "I love you, Dad. Thank you for the most perfect wedding day. I love you too, sweetheart. Have a wonderful honeymoon, and don't worry about anything here. Just focus on being happy with your new husband." As Lauren and David drove away in their decorated car, Richard stood in the parking lot feeling both emotionally drained and oddly hopeful. The paternity test results hadn't changed the fundamental truth of his relationship with Lauren. She was his daughter, and he was her father, in all the ways that truly mattered. But now he had to figure out how to handle Thomas Brennan's desire to meet Lauren and how to navigate the complicated emotions Diana was clearly struggling with. The perfect wedding was over, and real life was about to begin again. The morning after the wedding, Richard woke up in his empty house with a peculiar sense of displacement. Diana had spent the night at her sister's house, claiming she needed space to process everything that had happened. Jake and Emma were both at sleepovers, exhausted from the wedding festivities and wanting to recover with friends. For the first time in years, Richard found himself completely alone with his thoughts. He made coffee in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by remnants of wedding preparation, flower arrangements wilting on the counter, gift bags from out-of-town relatives, and a stack of thank you cards Lauren had prepared in advance for him and Diana to send while she was on her honeymoon. The normalcy of these domestic details felt surreal after the emotional earthquake of the past 24 hours. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Thomas Brennan. Diana gave me your contact information. I understand Lauren is my daughter. I'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss next steps. I'm staying at the Hampton Inn on Colfax Avenue until Thursday." Richard stared at the message for several minutes, trying to process the reality that Lauren's biological father was less than 10 miles away. The man who had walked out on Diana 24 years ago was now expecting some kind of relationship with the daughter he'd abandoned before she could walk. Rather than responding immediately, Richard decided to drive to the Botanic Gardens where the wedding had taken place. The venue was being cleaned and reset for another event, but he was able to walk through the areas where Lauren had taken her vows just hours earlier. Standing in the pavilion where they danced to Butterfly Kisses, he replayed their conversation about her knowing the truth of her paternity. Her acceptance of potentially meeting her biological father had seemed genuine, but Richard wondered if her perspective would change once she learned about the circumstances of Thomas's sudden reappearance. The man hadn't reached out because of some moral awakening or desire to make amends. He'd tracked Diana down specifically because he'd seen Lauren's engagement announcement and recognized her features. Diana called while Richard was driving home, her voice hoarse from crying. "Did he contact you yet?" "Thomas? Yes, he wants to meet. He's staying at a hotel until Thursday." "What are we going to do, Richard? Lauren said she'd be open to meeting him, but she doesn't know about the affair, doesn't know why he left, doesn't know that he threatened to show up at the wedding if I didn't arrange a meeting." Richard pulled into his driveway and sat in the car, engine running. "We need to talk to him first, before Lauren gets back from Italy. We need to understand what he really wants and set some ground rules." I can't face him alone, Diana admitted. Would you, would you come with me? The irony wasn't lost on Richard that Diana was asking him to help manage the man who had fathered his daughter during an affair. But despite everything, he understood that this situation was bigger than his hurt feelings or Diana's guilt. This was about protecting Lauren and handling a delicate situation with wisdom rather than emotion. I'll meet with him, Richard agreed, but we do this on our terms, not his. They arranged to meet Thomas that afternoon at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Denver that was public enough to keep emotions in check, but private enough for sensitive conversation. Richard arrived first and chose a corner table where they could speak without being overheard. Thomas Brennan walked in 15 minutes later, and Richard was struck by how much Lauren resembled him. The same hazel eyes with gold flecks, the same auburn hair that caught light in unexpected ways, the same strong jawline that Richard had always admired in his daughter. Seeing these familiar features on a stranger's face was deeply unsettling. Thomas was well-dressed and appeared successful, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had rebuilt his life after earlier failures. He looked nervous, but determined as he approached the table where Richard and Diana were waiting. "Thank you both for agreeing to meet with me," Thomas said as he sat down. "I know this is an unusual situation." "Unusual is one word for it," Richard replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Why now, Thomas? Why, after 24 years of silence, are you suddenly interested in being Lauren's father?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly prepared for this question, but still struggling with how to answer it honestly. "I've been sober for 5 years now. Part of my recovery program involves making amends to people I've hurt. I always knew I had a daughter out there, and I always intended to find her when I got my life together." "But you didn't find her through recovery readings or personal reflection," Diana interjected, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "You're right. Seeing that announcement was what pushed me to act, but the desire to meet her has been building for years. I've been following her accomplishments online, her college graduation, her job at the environmental nonprofit, the volunteer work she does. I'm proud of the woman she's become." "You don't get to be proud," Richard said quietly, but with steel in his voice. "You don't get to take credit for any part of who Lauren is. She became an extraordinary woman despite your absence, not because of it." "I understand that," Thomas replied, meeting Richard's gaze directly. "I'm not here to take anything away from you or to claim credit I don't deserve. I raised 2 kids with my ex-wife in Phoenix, and I know the difference between being a sperm donor and being a father. You're Lauren's father, but I am her biological parent, and I'd like the chance to know her, if she's willing." Diana spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. "What exactly are you proposing? A quick meeting to satisfy your curiosity, or some ongoing relationship?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I've thought about this moment for years, but I never figured out what comes after. I guess I'd like to meet her, explain why I left, apologize for not being there, and see if there's any possibility of having some kind of relationship going forward. Even if it's just exchanging Christmas cards, I'd like her to know what I think about her." Richard studied Thomas carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden motives. What he saw instead was a man who seemed genuinely remorseful, someone who had clearly given this significant thought, but was approaching it without a detailed agenda. "Lauren is on her honeymoon in Italy for the next 2 weeks," Richard said finally. "When she gets back, we'll tell her about you wanting to meet her. But we do this carefully, and we do it on her timeline, not yours." "What will you tell her about why I left?" Thomas asked. Diana and Richard exchanged glances. This was the conversation they'd been dreading: how to explain the affair, how to admit to Lauren that her parents' marriage had been troubled enough to seek comfort elsewhere. "I'll tell her the truth," Diana said, surprising both men with her decisiveness. "She deserves to know the real story, not some sanitized version that protects our feelings." "Are you sure about that?" Richard asked gently. "It's a lot to process right after her wedding." "She's not a child anymore, Richard. She's a married woman who's mature enough to handle adult truths about adult mistakes. And if she's going to have any kind of relationship with Thomas, she needs to understand the context." Thomas looked relieved that Diana was willing to be honest about the circumstances. "I appreciate that. I know it won't be easy to admit to the affair,
but Lauren deserves to understand that my leaving wasn't about not wanting her specifically. I was young and scared and completely unprepared for fatherhood, but those aren't excuses. They spent another hour discussing logistics and boundaries. Thomas would return to Phoenix and wait for Lauren to contact him if she chose to do so. There would be no surprise visits, no social media stalking, no attempts to circumvent Richard and Diana's role as her parents. If Lauren decided she wanted to meet him, it would happen in Denver, with Richard and Diana present, at least initially. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Thomas turned to Richard with obvious difficulty. "I need you to know that I'm grateful. Lauren turned out to be an incredible person, and that's because of you, not me. I'm not here to compete with you or to take your place. You're her father, and I respect that completely." Richard nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement, even as he struggled with the complicated emotions Thomas's presence evoked. "Just remember that if this goes badly, if you hurt her in any way, you'll have me to deal with." "Understood," Thomas replied, and shook Richard's hand before walking away.
As Richard and Diana sat in the coffee shop afterward, processing what had just happened, Diana finally spoke the words that had been weighing on her heart. "I'm sorry, Richard, for the affair, for keeping this secret, for letting you find out this way. You didn't deserve any of this." Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching traffic move past the window. "The affair happened a long time ago, when we were different people going through a difficult time. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt, but it's not the worst thing that's happened here." "What's the worst thing?" Diana asked quietly. "Almost missing Lauren's wedding day because I thought DNA mattered more than love," Richard replied. "Thomas may be her biological father, but I'm the one who gets to worry about her happiness for the rest of my life. That's not a burden, it's a privilege." Lauren and David returned from their honeymoon in Tuscany with sun-kissed skin, hundreds of photos, and the relaxed contentment of newlyweds who had spent 2 weeks exploring ancient cities and discovering new things about each other. They'd hiked through vineyards in Chianti, taken cooking classes in Florence, and spent lazy afternoons reading books on terraces overlooking the Mediterranean. The couple's first stop after the airport was Lauren's childhood home, where they planned to have dinner with her family and share stories from their trip. Lauren was practically glowing as she showed off the leather journal she'd bought in a Florentine market and the bottle of wine they'd selected from a small vineyard outside Siena. But the moment Lauren walked into her parents' house, she sensed something had shifted. Richard hugged her with his usual warmth, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there on her wedding day. Diana seemed nervous, fidgeting with her hands and asking too many questions about the flight and their luggage. Even Jake and Emma, who had been genuinely excited about hearing honeymoon stories, seemed subdued. They'd clearly been affected by whatever undercurrent of stress had filled the house during Lauren's absence. "Is everything okay?" Lauren asked during dinner, looking around the table at her family's strained expressions. "You all seem off." David had noticed it too, reaching under the table to squeeze Lauren's hand reassuringly. He'd grown close enough to the Matthews family to recognize when something was troubling them, and tonight felt different from typical family dinner dynamics. "We need to talk to you about something," Richard said carefully, setting down his fork. "It's not urgent, and it's not bad news exactly, but it's important." Lauren felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. What kind of something? Diana spoke up, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "It's about your biological father. He's reached out, and he wants to meet you." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Lauren's first reaction was confusion. She'd always assumed her biological father was completely out of the picture, perhaps even dead, since he'd never attempted contact before. "How did he find me?" she asked, looking between her parents. "He saw your engagement announcement in the newspaper," Richard explained. "He recognized you from the photo." Lauren was quiet for several minutes, processing this information while David watched her carefully. She'd mentioned her biological father only briefly during their relationship, always in the context of how grateful she was that Richard had stepped into that role so completely. "What's his name?" she asked finally. "Thomas Brennan," Diana replied. "He lives in Phoenix now. He owns a plumbing business and has been sober for 5 years." The detail about sobriety caught Lauren's attention immediately. Why was he left? Richard and Diana exchanged glances, clearly having prepared for this question, but still finding it difficult to answer honestly. It's more complicated than that, Diana said slowly. Thomas and we had a brief relationship while your father was deployed overseas. Richard wasn't your biological father, but he chose to raise you as his own from the moment we got married. Lauren absorbed this information with surprising calm, though David could feel the tension radiating from her body. So you had an affair? She said, matter-of-factly. Yes, Diana admitted, her cheeks flushing with shame. It was wrong, and I've regretted it every day since. When Thomas found out I was pregnant, he panicked and left town. He was young and scared and had his own problems with alcohol. And you never told him he had a daughter? I tried to reach him a few times when you were little, but he'd moved without leaving contact information. Eventually, I stopped trying. Richard was your father in every way that mattered, and I convinced myself it was better to leave the past alone. Lauren turned to Richard, studying his face carefully. How are you feeling about all this, Dad? The question surprised him. Even in the midst of processing major revelations about her own origins, Lauren was concerned about his emotional well-being. Honestly, it's been a difficult few weeks, Richard admitted. Learning about the paternity test results right before your wedding was overwhelming. But talking to Thomas helped me understand that this doesn't change anything fundamental about our relationship. You've already met him? Lauren asked. We met at a coffee shop a few days ago, Diana explained. We wanted to understand his motivations and set some boundaries before involving you. Lauren was quiet again, turning her wine glass slowly while she thought. David wanted to offer support, but he could tell she needed space to process this information on her own terms. What did you think of him? Lauren asked. He seems genuinely remorseful about leaving, Richard said carefully. He's not trying to take anything away from our family or claim credit for who you've become. He just wants the chance to meet you and apologize for not being there. He also wants to explain his side of what happened, Diana added. He understands that you might not be interested in any kind of ongoing relationship, but he'd like the opportunity to tell you himself why he left. Lauren looked around the table at her family. Richard, who had raised her with unconditional love. Diana, who was clearly struggling with guilt and anxiety. Jake and Emma, who were watching this conversation with wide eyes, probably learning details about their family history they'd never known. I think I'd like to meet him, Lauren said finally. I've always been curious about my biological father, but I never pushed the issue because I didn't want to hurt Dad's feelings or make Mom uncomfortable. Richard felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. He'd hoped Lauren would be open to meeting Thomas, but he was also worried about how the encounter might affect her, especially so soon after her wedding. Are you sure? He asked. There's no pressure to decide right now. You could take time to think about it. I'm sure, Richard replied, reaching over to squeeze his hand. But I want you and Mom there when I meet him, at least initially. And I want David there too, if that's okay. David nodded immediately. Of course, whatever you need.
They spent the next hour discussing logistics and Lauren's concerns. She wanted to know more about Thomas's life now, whether he was married, if he had other children, what kind of person he'd become since getting sober. She was curious about his medical history and family background, information that could be relevant for any children she and David might have someday. Most importantly, she wanted to understand the timeline of her parents' relationship problems and how the affair had happened. Diana was honest about the difficulties in her marriage to Richard during his deployment, the loneliness and stress that had made her vulnerable to Thomas's attention. I'm not making excuses, Diana said firmly. What I did was wrong, and it hurt people I loved. But I want you to understand that it wasn't about not loving your father or wanting to leave him. It was about making a terrible decision during a difficult time. Lauren absorbed these revelations with remarkable maturity, asking thoughtful questions and processing the information without judgment. David was impressed by her emotional intelligence and her ability to separate her parents' adult mistakes from their love for her. When can we arrange the meeting? Lauren asked as the evening wound down. Thomas is back in Phoenix, but he said he could return to Denver whenever you're ready, Richard replied. He's committed to doing this on your timeline, not his. Next weekend, Lauren suggested. That gives me a few days to prepare mentally, and it's soon enough that I won't spend weeks anxious about it. As Lauren and David prepared to leave for their own apartment, Lauren hugged each family member a little longer than usual. The honeymoon glow hadn't completely faded, but it was now mixed with anticipation and nervous energy about meeting the man who had contributed half her DNA, but none of her upbringing. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said to Diana and Richard. "I know it wasn't easy to admit to the affair or to risk my relationship with Thomas affecting our family dynamics." "We love you, sweetheart," Richard replied. "Nothing about that is going to change, no matter what happens with Thomas." That night, as Lauren and David lay in their own bed for the first time since returning from Italy, Lauren stared at the ceiling thinking about how much her understanding of her family history had expanded in a single evening. "How are you really feeling about all this?" David asked, sensing her restlessness. "Honestly, I'm nervous but also excited," Lauren admitted. "I've always felt like there was a missing piece to my identity, and now I might get some answers. But I'm also worried about how this might affect Dad. He's trying to be supportive, but I can tell this is hard for him." "Your dad is stronger than you think," David replied, "and he loves you enough to handle whatever complications come with Thomas being in the picture." Lauren hoped David was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that meeting her biological father would change her family's dynamics in ways none of them could predict. The meeting was arranged for Saturday afternoon at a private dining room in a restaurant downtown, neutral territory that would allow for intimate conversation while maintaining public boundaries. Lauren had chosen her outfit carefully, professional but approachable, wanting to make a good impression without appearing to try too hard. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early and sat in his car, rehearsing the words he'd been practicing for days. He'd brought a small photo album containing pictures of his parents and siblings, hoping Lauren might be interested in seeing her extended biological family. His hands shook slightly as he walked toward the restaurant entrance. Richard, Diana, Lauren, and David arrived together, presenting a united front that immediately communicated to Thomas the strength of their family bonds. Lauren walked between her parents, drawing visible support from their presence while maintaining her own composure. When Thomas stood up as they entered the private dining room, the resemblance between him and Thomas was startling to everyone present. They had the same way of tilting their heads when thinking, the same expressive eyebrows, and the same unconscious gesture of tucking hair behind their ears when nervous. "Hello," Lauren said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Hello," Lauren replied, studying his face with open curiosity. "You look like my great-aunt Margaret. She had the same eyes." The observation broke some of the initial tension, and Thomas smiled with genuine warmth. "My mother always said I had my grandmother's eyes. Maybe that's where you got them too." They sat around a circular table, with Lauren positioned between Richard and David, a seating arrangement that clearly established her support system while still allowing for direct conversation with Thomas. For the first few minutes, the conversation was awkward and formal. Thomas had prepared a speech about his regrets and his reasons for leaving, but sitting across from his grown daughter, the words seemed inadequate. Instead, he found himself simply looking at her, marveling at the intelligent, confident woman she'd become. "I know you have questions," Thomas said finally. "I'll answer anything you want to know, and I'll understand if some of my answers disappoint you." Lauren had indeed prepared questions, but facing Thomas in person made her approach them differently than she'd planned. "Why didn't you ever try to find me before now?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without making excuses. "Fear, mostly. When I left, I was 22 years old, drinking heavily, and completely unprepared for fatherhood. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me, and that turned out to be true. But as the years went by, my fear of disrupting your life became mixed with shame about staying away so long." "What changed your mind?" "Getting sober forced me to confront a lot of things I'd been avoiding. In recovery, they teach you to make amends to people you've hurt, but I struggled with whether contacting you would help you or just make me feel better. When I saw your engagement announcement, I realized I was running out of time to make that choice." Lauren absorbed this explanation, recognizing the honesty in his admission about self-serving motivations. "Tell me about your life now. Are you married? Do you have other children?"
Thomas nodded, pulling out his phone to show pictures. I was married for 8 years to a woman named Susan. We divorced amicably 3 years ago, but we have 2 children together, your half-siblings. Michael is 16 and Sarah is 14. They know about you, and they're curious about meeting you someday if you're interested. The revelation that she had teenage half-siblings caught Lauren off guard. She thought about Thomas as an individual, but hadn't considered that meeting him might mean gaining an extended family. What did you tell them about me? The truth, that I made mistakes when I was young that resulted in me missing out on knowing my eldest daughter, but that their half-sister was raised by a good man who loved her completely. Thomas glanced at Richard with respect. I also told them that any relationship with you would depend entirely on what you wanted, and that they should never expect anything from you just because you share DNA. Richard found himself appreciating Thomas's approach to this delicate situation. The man was being appropriately humble about his role, while not minimizing the potential significance of biological connections. Do you have questions for me? Lauren asked, turning the conversation around.
Thomas's face lit up with interest. I'd love to know about your work, your interests, and what makes you happy. Diana mentioned you work for an environmental nonprofit? Lauren spent the next 20 minutes talking about her job with the Colorado Environmental Coalition, her passion for water conservation, and her weekend volunteer work with habitat restoration projects. Thomas listened with obvious pride and engagement, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine interest in her life and values. You get your environmental consciousness from my father, Thomas said when she paused. He was a forest ranger for 30 years and taught me to respect nature, even when I wasn't listening to much else he said. Diana spoke up for the first time since introductions. Lauren has always been drawn to outdoor activities. Even as a little girl, she preferred camping trips to amusement parks. That's definitely genetic, Thomas smiled. My whole family are outdoors people. Your grandmother still goes backpacking at 78. As the conversation continued, Lauren found herself relaxing into the interaction. Thomas was nothing like the irresponsible young man who had abandoned her mother. He was thoughtful, articulate, and clearly had worked hard to become someone worthy of respect. I have something for you, Thomas said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I brought some photos of your biological grandparents and other relatives, in case you're interested in seeing where some of your features come from. Lauren accepted the photo album with careful curiosity, flipping through pictures of people who shared her facial structure and coloring. David leaned over to look with her, pointing out resemblances and asking questions about the relatives Thomas described. Your grandfather would have loved you, Thomas said, pointing to a photo of a tall man in a ranger uniform. He always said the family needed more women with strong opinions and the intelligence to back them up. After 2 hours of conversation, Lauren felt emotionally drained but satisfied. Meeting Thomas had answered questions she'd carried her entire life, while confirming that Richard had indeed been the father she needed during her formative years. What happens now? Thomas asked as they prepared to leave. I don't want to push for more than you're comfortable with, but I'd like to stay in touch if you're open to it. Lauren looked at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. I think I'd like that. Maybe we could start with emails or phone calls and see how it goes. I'm definitely interested in meeting Michael and Sarah eventually, if they want to meet me. They would love that, replied, but only when you're ready. As they said goodbye in the restaurant parking lot, Thomas shook hands with Richard and Diana before turning to Lauren. I know I can never make up for not being there when you were growing up, but I want you to know that learning about the woman you've become is one of the best things that's ever happened to me. Lauren surprised herself by hugging him goodbye. Thank you for being honest today and for respecting the family that raised me. That evening, as Lauren and David processed the meeting over dinner at home, Lauren reflected on how the day had exceeded her expectations. He's nothing like I imagined, she told David. I expected to feel angry or resentful, but mostly I just felt curious and a little sad about all the years we missed. How do you think your dad handled it? David asked. Better than I expected. I could tell it was hard for him to watch me connect with Thomas, but he was supportive throughout the whole thing. I think seeing that Thomas respects his role in my life made it easier. 3 months later, Lauren had established a comfortable email correspondence with Thomas, and had video called with her half-siblings twice. The relationships were developing slowly and naturally, without pressure or unrealistic expectations. Richard found that his initial fears about losing Lauren to her biological father had been unfounded. If anything, meeting Thomas had reinforced Lauren's appreciation for the man who had raised her with constant love and support. She made a point of calling Richard more frequently and including him in updates about her correspondence with the Brennan family. Diana and Richard's marriage had also found new stability through the process of honestly confronting their past. Working together to support Lauren through meeting Thomas had reminded them of their shared priorities and values. On Lauren's 24th birthday, she received cards from both families, the Matthews family who had shaped her life, and the Brennan family who were getting to know her as an adult. Standing in her kitchen reading birthday wishes from people who loved her in different ways, Lauren felt complete in a way she'd never experienced before. The paternity test that had threatened to shatter her family had instead expanded it, proving that love and biology could coexist without competition and that being chosen as a daughter was just as meaningful as being born one. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.